Hello. My motif for the novel Invisible Man, written by Ralph Ellison, is grandfather's advice. So, what my motif is as it was introduced in towards the end of chapter 1, is when Invisible Man's grandfather, or I am as we'll refer to him throughout this presentation, warned him about ambition and selfishness and how those in the world who are against him will try to abuse his ambition. The most prevalent piece of his advice is when grandfather states, "I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction, let them swallow you till they vomit or bust wide open." This motif is most widely used throughout the book, as I.M. uses it to compare himself to either achieving his goals of becoming successful, getting revenge, or just knowing, towards the end, just knowing what freedom actually means. And so I.M. also meets several people, such as the vet and Mary, who takes him in, and Brother Tarp, who's in the Brotherhood, and Ras, who is basically considered his enemy. So these are the visuals I chose that represent my motif of grandfather's advice. This smile represents the advice because he talks about agreeing with them and undermining them with yeses, and this basically represents having to show a facade or putting on a smiling face so that they feel less threatened, but I.M. would also be able to achieve his goals of helping his people get to freedom. I also chose the broken shackles because I.M.'s grandfather was a freed slave, but he also knew the struggles of being oppressed, and he felt like he wanted to pass down his goals to I.M. so that he could finally achieve his goals of helping his people achieve freedom. I also chose this picture from the cartoon Spy vs. Spy because before grandfather dies, he talks about how he lived a life of treachery and how he wasn't able to help his people the way he wanted to because he lived in a sort of Booker T. Washington way in which he just did his work and he kind of accepted the segregation of society. But he felt like he had been a traitor because he never did anything in order to help his people be free. And then my last visual is a sort of guilty face because throughout the book, I.M. feels a sort of subconscious guilt, like he wants to help his people, but he has his own goals in mind. And so this subconscious guilt leads him on a sort of vacillating journey, which he goes towards and back away from achieving his humanity and knowing what freedom is, based on his grandfather's advice. And so this guilty face is kind of the constant feeling that I.M. has throughout the book until he finally realizes what freedom actually means. The first example of grandfather's advice is actually on the same page in which he states the advice, but a little bit after. And it states, "When I was praised for my conduct, I felt the guilt that in some way I was doing something that was really against the wishes of the white folks. That if they had understood, they would have desired me to act just the opposite. That I should have been sulky and mean, and that really would have been what they wanted." So this is after I.M. has just received grandfather's advice and he has processed it, and he has applied it to the way he's lived his life up to that point. And he talks about how he has really worked to achieve the approval of the white people in his community, how he was a top student in his high school and he works hard and he just basically does everything in his power to please them. But he still feels a kind of guilt because they want him to be almost a typical African American in the South, in which they're poor and they're not educated. But he feels a guilt, but this guilt is not the guilt that his grandfather wants him to feel, because he's feeling guilty towards the white folk instead of feeling guilty towards his own people for not helping them yet have achieved the freedom that they want. The third example is the vet's speech to Mr. Norton. As stated earlier, the vet is one of the characters in which the grandfather is sort of reflected, or we can refer to them as grandfather figures. He's like this because he's sort of, even though he's put into a mental institution, he's almost treated like he has too much sanity, because he talks to the white people like he is on the same level as them, and he just has the ability to see so clearly that they think that he's insane. And so in the quote it says, "You see," he said, turning to Mr. Norton, "he has eyes and ears and a good distended African nose, but he fails to understand the simple facts of life. He's learned to repress not only his emotions, but his humanity. He's invisible, a walking personification of the negative, the most perfect achievement of your dreams, sir." So in this is the first time where I am really hears that he's invisible. And he also hears that he's basically been molded into this automaton to achieve the works of the people who oppress him. And even though that I am thinks he is going along with his grandfather's advice of agreeing with them and doing what they ask, he's actually working against himself because they're only taking advantage of the way he's acting. And he's not doing it to undermine them, but he's doing it so that he can go along with them, even though that they don't want him there. And so in this, the advice is reflected because he's working against himself, even though he's working so hard to achieve what he wants. The sixth example is Rass's spiteful words, and it says that, "Remember that I am no black traitor to the black people for the white people." And within this, Rass is, in the context of this quote, Rass has just finished his little wrestle with Brother Clifton and I am. And he's basically insulting them, saying that I am not a traitor, I know my place in society, and I would never work for the enemy. But he's also relaying grandfather's advice, because he talks about how he's not oppressed by the white people in society because he knows how to work against them. And even though he's not working against them in the way that grandfather advised to I am, he's also not a traitor in the way that grandfather believed himself to be, because he's still putting an effort towards freeing his people, just not in the same way as agreeing with them or undermining them with yeses, but he still knows that deep down he's trying to achieve a goal of freedom for his people. And also, the reason why I have a picture of my favorite superhero, Black Panther, is because Rass talks to Brother Clifton and he says that if you were to join the Back to Africa movement, you would be treated as a king, because he's the quintessential black man. He's smart, he's skilled, he's handsome, he's strong. And so Rass basically looks at him and says, "You are wasting your potential by working for those who want to oppress you. If you join my movement, then you could be treated as if you were almost godlike and superhuman." And just like Black Panther, he believes that Clifton could be a chief or a king. The seventh example is Brother Tarp's message to I am. It states, "I took it in my hand, a thick, dark, oily piece of filed steel that had been twisted open and forced partly back into place, on which I saw marks that might have been made by the blade of a hatchet. It was such a link as I had seen on Bledsoe's desk, only while that one had been smooth, Tarp's bore the marks of haste and violence, looking as though it had been attacked and conquered before it stubbornly yielded." So the context of this quote is basically when I am has just received the anonymous note while he has joined the Brotherhood. And it talks about how be careful, watch your back, you're working for the enemy and you don't really know what you're doing. And Brother Tarp comes into his office and I am states that he sees his grandfather reflected in him. So as Brother Tarp could be considered a grandfather figure, he also relays grandfather's advice, because with his chain that he gives to I am, he represents the same struggle that I am's grandfather went through. And he knows the hard work and the blood and sweat and tears that have gone into trying to help the black population achieve true freedom in America. And even though I Am compares the link on the chain on Bledsoe's desk to the chain that Brother Tarp gives him, it's kind of a contrast between the two ways his ambition could lead him. It could lead him to a sort of facade of freedom in which it looks like he struggled, but he's really only worked only to be in the same place. Or he could have struggle and actually work and do what he can to fight against the oppressor in order to actually break away from the ties and boundaries that hold him back as a Black man in society. And the ninth and final example is I Am's final monologue in the epilogue, which states, and my mind revolved again and again back to my grandfather. Did he mean say yes because he knew that the principle was greater than men, greater than the numbers and the vicious power and all the methods used to corrupt its name? Did he mean to affirm the principle which they themselves had dreamed into being out of the chaos and darkness of the feudal past, in which they had violated and compromised to the point of absurdity, even in their own corrupt minds? So in this, I Am actually references his grandfather's advice, and now that he's in hiding and he's in his hole with stolen light, and he's trying to figure out the truth towards what his purpose is and why his grandfather had given him the advice that he had, I Am questions what his grandfather's advice truly means. And what I took away from it and how it was reflected in this quote is that the grandfather's advice was to help I Am achieve the principle, which the principle is freedom. And in this, I Am's grandfather knew that the principle is deeply reflected within America's own history, and in the fact that those who formed the country made it out of the chaos and darkness of the feudal past, meaning the tyranny of Great Britain, and they had violated and compromised to the point of absurdity even in their own corrupt minds. They thought that they were forming a country that was truly based off of freedom, but even though they themselves were enjoying a certain form of freedom, there were still those who lived there that were oppressed, meaning the groups in society that were marginalized, and especially the Black population that were enslaved and forced to do certain kinds of labor against their will. And so in this, in the epilogue, I Am is finally realizing that the grandfather's advice was, even though he wanted him to have ambition and to have goals, he wanted him to reflect it in a sort of way which he could help his people as a whole achieve freedom. And I Am realizes that his purpose was to write his experiences so that others that are just like him can learn from them and know how to truly achieve freedom and how to live the principle. And so this is reflected in like America's culture, and I Am finally realizing what it means to be part of the American dream of freedom. And I think that grandfather's advice best develops this theme. In order for an individual to achieve true freedom and live a life that is only dictated by that individual, one must accept that there are certain boundaries set for certain groups by society, but by knowing those boundaries, one has the power to overcome them. I think that the motif of grandfather's advice best develops this theme because when grandfather first gives the advice to I Am, he knows that he has to overcome certain boundaries. He has to overcome the stereotypes that are in the South about Black people. He has to overcome the goals that other people will have for him and how they'll try to use his ambition and his knowledge. And he'll have to overcome himself and trying to figure out his identity and his role in society. But I Am's grandfather knew that once he finally knew those boundaries and identified them, and he would overcome them and eventually achieve the principle or true freedom, because he will know where he has come from and what he has worked towards, and therefore he can help other people to go down that same path and achieve true freedom for themselves. So, thank you.